The morning fog had barely lifted from the quiet suburban hills when a dusty Subaru Outback pulled into the driveway of Clear Lux Auto Spa, a high-end car wash nestled between a designer pet boutique and a cold brew cafe where the baristas wore tailored aprons. The sleek, glass-fronted building reflected the early sun like a showroom, its spotless entrance flanked by velvet rope stands and silver signage that read, "Because your car deserves luxury too." The Subaru looked out of place among the shiny Porsches and Teslas already lined up for their appointments, its rear windows clouded with a fine film of dust, a forgotten art supply box rattling in the trunk, and a thin trail of dry leaves stuck to the back bumper like a souvenir from a road less untraveled. From the driver's seat stepped Julia Harper, a woman in her late 20s whose quiet beauty seemed untouched by vanity. Her blonde hair, pulled into a loose ponytail, caught the soft light as she adjusted the hood of her oversized sweatshirt. Faded leggings, paint-stained sneakers, and a simple canvas tote completed her appearance, one that radiated practicality over polish. She looked tired but centered, the kind of tired that comes not from laziness but from effort, from time spent in fields, in classrooms, in places where people forget themselves for the sake of something bigger. That morning, she had driven back from a community mural project at a veterans' home 2 towns over. Her back sore from painting standing walls and her hands raw from cold wind and turpentine. Despite her appearance, there was a steadiness to the way she walked, unhurried, measured, as though she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. When she entered the reception area, she gave a small, polite smile to the front desk associate, a young woman in flawless makeup, glossy lips, and a pristine branded uniform. Julia's voice was soft, but her words clear. "Hi, I know I didn't book in advance, but I was hoping you might have room for a quick full wash and interior vacuum. Nothing fancy, just basic service." She glanced behind her briefly, suddenly aware of how much dust her car had brought in with it. The receptionist didn't smile back. Instead, her eyes traveled the length of Julia's hoodie, her messy tote, and the paint-flecked phone she clutched awkwardly in one hand. The pause lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then came the response, rehearsed and polite but pointed. "I'm sorry, we're only taking pre-booked premium clients today. Maybe try the drive-thru wash on Westwood? It's more casual." Julia blinked slowly. She nodded once, said, "Thank you," and stepped back toward the door. But her hand, as it reached for the handle, briefly tightened. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Julia stepped outside, the glass door whispering shut behind her, with the quiet precision of well-oiled hinges. The morning sun had climbed higher, sharpening the reflections on the polished cars lined up outside Clear Lux Auto Spa. She lingered on the pavement for a moment, the sound of water jets and soft brushes audible in the background. Across the street, a row of boutique shops was just beginning to open, and somewhere a delivery truck reversed with a rhythmic beep that felt distant, unreal. Julia stood still, not confused or lost, but as if something essential had momentarily unhooked from the rhythm of her day. She hadn't expected luxury or special treatment, only the courtesy of a basic service. It wasn't the refusal that struck her. It was the way the girl behind the desk had looked at her, not with annoyance or pity, but with that unmistakable, surgically precise judgment that wealthy spaces often conceal behind velvet ropes and perfect lighting. From the corner of her eye, Julia saw another car pull up to the same driveway. A white Mercedes G-Wagon, spotless, freshly waxed, the kind of car that seemed to exist more for display than movement. The driver was a woman in designer athleisure, sunglasses perched high on her head, a miniature dog squirming in her lap. She rolled down the window halfway, exchanged a laugh with one of the attendants who had suddenly appeared curbside, and handed him a small wad of cash. There was no booking, no app, no code to scan. The gates opened almost theatrically, and the car was waved through, the dog barking sharply as if echoing the subtle cruelty of the place. Julia watched, her arms crossed, her fingers unconsciously brushing a smear of dry paint on her hoodie sleeve. She turned back to the front desk and re-entered, her steps still calm, still measured. The receptionist looked up, her expression immediately cooling. Julia didn't raise her voice. "Just now," she said, her tone even, "you told me you only take pre-booked clients. That woman, she didn't have an appointment, did she?" The silence between them was brittle, as though one wrong syllable would shatter the room's sterile calm. The receptionist blinked slowly, then smiled with practiced composure. We make exceptions sometimes, she said. Regulars, VIPs, I'm sure you understand. It was not what she said, but how she said it. There was no apology, no pretense of fairness. Just the smooth corporate tone of someone who'd learned how to deny people without appearing cruel. Julia didn't flinch. She didn't argue or beg. She simply looked into the woman's eyes with the kind of gaze that holds. For a moment, the receptionist faltered, her fingers tapping the desk nervously, uncertain whether to escalate or retreat. Julia turned to leave again. A male employee near the window, young, underdressed, wearing rubber gloves, laughed under his breath and muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Should have hosed it down herself before coming here." Another voice, female this time, chimed in with a low chuckle. "That car looks like it's allergic to soap." They weren't talking to her. They were talking around her, about her, like she was some inconvenient ghost haunting their pristine corridor of wealth. And in that moment, Julia wasn't just herself. She was every person who had ever walked into a place and been told, without being told, that they didn't belong. She paused just at the edge of the glass door, letting her hand rest on the handle. Her reflection stared back at her. Hair pulled back, cheeks flushed from the early sun, dust clinging to the hem of her leggings. A woman who had painted for 10 hours straight the day before. A woman who had built a foundation with her own hands. A woman who had never once needed someone's permission to be valuable. She let the silence stretch. Then, with a smile that wasn't quite warm but wasn't cruel either, she said, "You know, sometimes people remember how they were treated more than what was said." The words hung in the air, heavier than her tone suggested. She stepped outside once more, not in defeat but in quiet resolution. She didn't look back, but she heard it. Another quiet laugh, sharper this time, coming from somewhere inside. Perhaps at her words, or perhaps because the luxury space had already closed its gates behind her, confident that the day's schedule would continue undisturbed. And for the staff at Clear Lux, it would. For now. The sky had begun to pale into a soft gray by the time Julia pulled into her garage later that afternoon, the heavy wooden door sliding shut behind her with a low, mechanical groan. Inside, the space was cool and dim, lit only by slats of natural light filtering through high transom windows. The moment she turned off the ignition, silence pressed around her. Dense, familiar, almost sacred. This wasn't just a garage. It was a chapel of stories. The air carried the smell of old leather, engine oil, and dust from sandpaper used on chrome edges. There were no marble floors here, no velvet ropes, no lattes in hand, or iPads at the front desk. Just machines, memory, and muscle. Julia stepped out of her Subaru, stretched the stiffness from her shoulders, and walked slowly past a line of shapes draped in cream-colored car covers, each one precisely labeled with a small brass tag. She stopped in front of the smallest shape in the corner, knelt down, and peeled back the canvas. Beneath it rested a 1972 Dino 246 GT, candy apple red, curves softened by time and polish. She let her fingers drift over the hood, the paintwork still gleaming despite the years. It had been her first restoration, completed at 24, entirely self-taught, guided by books, YouTube videos, and the fading notebook of her grandfather, a former race mechanic who had once driven across the country just to hear an engine sing properly. That car, like all the others in the space, wasn't just a machine. It was inheritance. It was resistance. It was evidence. Julia stood, dusted her hands on her leggings, and walked toward the back office. Really more of a converted supply closet with a desk littered in blueprints, wrenches, chipped coffee mugs, and faded Polaroids of car shows. On the wall hung her degree in mechanical engineering, ignored and unframed. She booted up an old laptop and opened a folder titled simply Fleet. Inside were documents with names like LaFerrari Black DXL SX, Aston DB 4 notes.pdf, and EB110 transport log.doc. Her eyes scanned the columns, flipping through data that only she could understand at a glance. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but she had been dismissed, not because of what she didn't have, but because of what they had assumed she didn't. Later that night, after a long shower and dinner eaten standing by the sink, she stood barefoot in front of her long mirror, brushing out her damp hair. Her reflection looked no different than it had that morning. Still her, still quiet, still unadorned. But her eyes had settled into a new focus. Not of anger, not revenge. Something else. A choice. She reached for her phone and tapped a number labeled simply Joe Transport. When the familiar voice picked up, she didn't offer a greeting. "Hey," she said, "I need a pickup rotation for tomorrow morning. 6 cars, tell the team to wear black. No branding, no questions." A beat passed on the other end of the line. Then came a simple affirmative grunt. No names, no further explanation. They had done this before, but never for this reason. When the call ended, Julia leaned back against the doorframe and closed her eyes. She let the sound of the cooling garage settle around her like a blanket. She had no need to embarrass anyone. She wasn't planning a spectacle, but sometimes silence had to arrive with an engine's growl. Sometimes you had to drive back, not to make noise, but to remind people that not all power comes with sound. And not all presence comes dressed in leather seats and designer sunglasses. At sunrise, while the Clearlux staff were still rolling up metal grates and unlocking cash drawers, Julia's driveway filled with movement. One by one, a fleet of rare, impeccably preserved automobiles emerged into the sleepy light. A silver Mercedes, 300 SL Gullwing with butterfly doors that hissed open like a whisper of history, a black Ferrari F40 with a raw, predatory stance, a Jaguar E-Type painted deep forest green, polished to a mirror sheen. Behind them, a Rolls-Royce Ghost in midnight blue idled quietly, the driver straight-backed and still. Julia, in a loose tan coat and driving gloves, slipped into the front seat beside him with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove and everything under control. She said nothing during the drive. She didn't need to rehearse her words. Her point would be made in silence, in chrome, in contrast. Behind her, the rest of the fleet followed like a procession. Elegant, dignified, utterly foreign to the morning chaos of commuter SUVs and delivery vans. As they approached the Clearlux lot, Julia could see the employees outside in their pressed uniforms, sipping coffee, chatting lazily under heat lamps. One of them pointed. Another froze with his mouth open mid-laugh. The manager stepped outside, squinting, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The same driveway that had turned her away 24 hours earlier now reflected back the mirrored image of wealth they had chosen to worship. The cars pulled in, engines purring in perfect harmony, forming a clean arc in front of the entrance. The staff had stopped talking. Phones weren't pulled out. No one dared. It wasn't social media viral. It was worse. It was personal. Julia stepped out and adjusted her gloves. Her hair was down, untouched by wind, and she wore no makeup, just a quiet smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't look for the receptionist. She didn't need to. Everyone saw her now. Julia stood beside the Rolls-Royce without saying a word. The morning light struck the long hoods of the assembled cars just so, glinting off their chrome like lines drawn under an exclamation point. The air around Clearlux Auto Spa had changed, heavy now with tension, curiosity, and something else less defined, a quiet displacement of control. The very ground seemed to shift beneath the feet of those who had laughed at her just a day earlier. A technician nervously pulled at the collar of his uniform. Another fumbled with a squeegee and quickly ducked into the garage. Only the manager remained outside, arms crossed, his smile thin and uncertain, his mouth already forming the empty, rehearsed words of customer service before Julia even reached him. She didn't rush. Her steps were deliberate but not dramatic. Her heels clicked softly on the polished concrete, and she moved as someone who had never needed permission to enter a room. He offered a handshake. She didn't take it. She didn't need to. Instead, she looked him in the eye with a quiet patience that felt heavier than anger. 6 vehicles, she said, her voice steady, almost polite. Interior and exterior detailing. Full ceramic, paint-safe drying. No shortcuts. The manager swallowed and nodded quickly, gesturing toward his staff, who now lined up in a kind of awkward semicircle, like school children sensing a lecture but not its cause. Of course, he said, we'd be honored to take care of... She interrupted him, not rudely but decisively. No honor needed, just care. And silence. He opened his mouth again, but she had already turned away, walking slowly toward one of the parked vehicles, her gloved hand trailing lightly along the fender of the Jaguar, as though she were calming an animal. The staff watched her, unsure what to say, unsure what this even was. It wasn't a performance, not quite. It wasn't an attack either. There were no cameras, no journalists, no spectacle. Only presence. And the unsettling realization that the woman they had dismissed yesterday might now be their most important client. The receptionist from the day before had appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She wore the same uniform, the same perfect makeup, but something in her posture had shifted. Her arms were folded but tighter now, almost defensive. Julia didn't even glance at her, not out of spite, but because her focus was elsewhere. On the work, on the machines, on the unspoken principle she had carried here like a weight too long ignored. She stepped into the waiting lounge, sat down in the far corner, and pulled out a small sketchbook from her canvas tote. The same bag she'd carried the day before, still speckled with paint, still unwashed, still hers. She flipped open the first page and began to sketch. Quick lines, nothing precious, just rhythm, motion, discipline. The humming of hoses and the rustle of microfiber towels in the bay outside rose and fell like waves against her concentration. One of the younger workers, no older than 22, approached hesitantly with a clipboard. He didn't know her story. He hadn't been on the morning shift when they'd sent her away. All he saw was a quiet woman who knew things he didn't, and cars he couldn't afford to dream of. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice cracked slightly from nerves. Do you want to see our process? You could, supervise if you want. Make sure we get it right." She looked up, not with annoyance, but with a kind of warmth he hadn't expected. She studied him for a beat, then closed her sketchbook and rose. "Thank you," she said, taking the clipboard without hesitation. "Let's begin with the dyno. She's the most sensitive." He nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face, and followed her outside. The others watched as she walked with him into the bay. Not commanding, not correcting, but instructing with precision, patience, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need to prove itself. She showed him how to approach the trim without streaking, explained the value of pH-balanced soap, even offered a technique to remove micro-scratches without damaging the original gloss. And slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamic in the shop began to shift. She was no longer just a client. She was a presence, a teacher, a quiet authority. The woman from yesterday had vanished into the exhaust fumes of the arriving supercars. In her place stood someone they had not seen before, because they had not bothered to look. By midday, the work was halfway done. Julia stood by the open hood of the Aston, answering a question from one of the detailers about carbon filters. Not lecturing. Sharing. She wasn't there for revenge. That much was clear now. She was there to test something deeper, to see if respect once denied could be earned the hard way. By showing, not shouting. The receptionist passed behind her silently, her eyes lowered. She wasn't dismissed, she wasn't shamed. She was simply not centered anymore. And in that quiet rebalancing, Julia achieved something most people never manage. Not dominance, not praise, but influence. The sun had reached its peak, casting a sharp white light across the lot, making the cars gleam like sculptures under a spotlight. By now, the entire staff at Clearlux Auto Spa had grown unnervingly quiet, the usual easy banter and background chatter replaced by a kind of subdued hyper-awareness. Julia had taken over the garage space without asking for permission, not by force, but through the quiet authority of someone who clearly knew more than those who had tried to dismiss her. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't name-dropped anyone, and yet now each technician and attendant had begun to mirror her language, adjust to her standards, and defer to her experience. Not because they were told to, but because it had become impossible not to. Something about her presence rearranged the internal structure of the place. The hierarchy had inverted, but with a grace that made it feel natural, almost inevitable. The receptionist, Claire, stood by the desk watching through the tall windows. Her arms were crossed tightly against her chest, but her jaw had softened. The makeup she had applied that morning was beginning to smudge slightly under the pressure of her expression. Not from heat, but from the slow erosion of certainty. The day before, she had dismissed Julia with a well-practiced smile, the same smile she'd used countless times to separate the deserving from the inconvenient. Now, as Julia crouched beside the front wheel of a McLaren P1, calmly showing a junior employee how to preserve the rotor seal while pressure rinsing, Claire understood something she hadn't known she was missing. The way real knowledge, when quietly demonstrated, could unmake pretension in seconds. From the side lot, a low, steady hum interrupted the heavy silence. A flatbed truck was approaching, one of the ones Julia had summoned earlier in the day. It was carrying something different this time. Not a hypercar or classic European coupe. On the platform sat a matte gray, military-style Jeep Wagoneer, with dust still clinging to the undercarriage. It looked entirely out of place among the glassy curves and gleaming polish of the rest of the fleet. The staff turned, confused. The truck came to a stop, and from the cab stepped an older man with sun-wrinkled skin and a mechanic's gait, the kind of man who didn't waste words and whose clothes always bore a permanent hint of machine grease. He didn't look like a driver. He looked like someone who had built things that lasted. Julia walked up to him and they exchanged a handshake. Not staged, not performative, but familiar. "You got her here fast," she said, glancing at the Jeep. He nodded. "Didn't even wipe the mud off. Thought you might want the whole effect." Julia smiled, and for a moment, something in her expression broke through the controlled surface. Something almost tender. She turned back to the lot and raised her voice slightly, enough to carry across the open space. "I want this one cleaned next. No polish, no wax. Just a proper rinse and an interior sweep. Handle her with the same care you would any of the others." A few of the employees exchanged looks. One of them, the same young man who had approached her with the clipboard earlier, stepped forward. "Is it yours?" he asked. Julia nodded. "This one belonged to my father. He taught me how to rebuild engines in that passenger seat. We drove through 7 states in one summer when I was 16. It doesn't need to shine. It just needs to breathe again." There was a pause, then a quiet ripple of motion as the staff moved toward the Jeep, with a different energy now. Gentler, less performative. They weren't impressing her anymore. They were trying to live up to something. Claire remained by the window, now seated at the reception desk, staring at her screen without really seeing anything. It had taken less than half a day for everything to tilt. Not violently, but unmistakably. Her role, once central, had been moved to the periphery, not out of punishment, but through the quiet exposure of her limitations. She wasn't hated. She simply wasn't needed in the way she had believed, and that somehow cut deeper. Inside the lounge, Julia accepted a cup of water from one of the staff, murmured a thank you, and sat back down to resume sketching in her notebook. She didn't seem triumphant or pleased. If anything, she looked thoughtful. Her pencil moved slowly now, not with the brisk precision of morning, but with the heaviness of reflection. A shift had occurred, and not just in the room. In her. Her phone buzzed once. A message. She glanced at it briefly, then smiled. It was from a curator in San Francisco asking if she'd be willing to lend the Dino for a special exhibit on women in automotive preservation. The irony made her laugh quietly. She typed a quick response. "Maybe. Let's see how she handles today." Outside, the crew had finished detailing the ghost. The manager approached cautiously, holding out a folded invoice and a branded envelope. "Miss Harper," he began, his tone tight with formality. "We'd like to offer the services complimentary today. As a token of—" She cut him off, not unkindly, but firmly. "Don't." Her gaze met his. "You don't owe me anything. You owe yourselves a better standard." He hesitated, then nodded, unsure what to say in response. She stood again, walked slowly through the row of completed vehicles, and paused at the end of the line. One by one, she examined each car, not for vanity, but for care. For whether the work had been done thoughtfully, with respect. When she reached the last one, the Jaguar, she looked over at the young technician who had worked on it. "Beautiful job," she said. His face lit up with something shy, something proud, something lasting. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when Julia gathered her things and prepared to leave. She gave no speeches. There was no final declaration. No public takedown. Instead, she paused by the front entrance, her eyes scanning the facility one last time. Then she turned to Claire, who had finally risen from her seat, unsure of what to expect. Julia walked toward her, and for a moment the silence became suffocating. She offered her hand. "I hope you'll stay," she said. "You're good at what you do. You just forgot what that should mean." Claire stared at her, then slowly took the hand, the gesture heavier than words. "Thank you," she whispered. Julia nodded once and stepped out into the late light, the glass door closing behind her with the same soft sound it had made that morning. But this time, everything on the other side of it was different. The golden hour had begun to stretch its amber light across the edges of the parking lot, casting long reflections on the polished cars now lined up like sentinels awaiting quiet inspection. The staff had grown noticeably still, not out of exhaustion, but anticipation. Something was ending or perhaps beginning, though no one could quite name it. Julia stood alone near the Jeep Wagoneer, watching the last drops of rinse water slide down its aged body. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning either. Her face held the kind of expression people wear when they are somewhere between memory and certainty. In the distance, a soft wind pushed through the ornamental grasses planted along the lot's perimeter, and even that sound seemed to hush itself. The manager stood nearby, arms behind his back, his posture no longer defensive but contemplative. He had been watching her all afternoon, trying to reconcile the woman he had waved away the day before with the one who had now quietly turned his business into something that felt more like a classroom, a gallery, a reckoning. The young technician who had worked on the Jaguar hovered at a distance, nervously polishing a cloth between his fingers, hoping for another nod of approval, but too shy to seek it outright. Claire stood near the desk, uncertain whether she should be inside or outside, employee or witness. No one quite knew how to frame what had happened here. It hadn't been revenge. It hadn't even been about money. And then, as if by cue, a silver Lexus slowly turned into the driveway. It was understated but refined, the kind of car driven by someone successful who no longer needed to broadcast it. A tall woman in her early 60s stepped out, dressed in a navy pantsuit and low heels, her hair elegantly swept back. She looked around, puzzled, then spotted Julia and smiled. "I wasn't sure if I'd catch you," she said. "You didn't reply to my message." Julia turned, warmth softening her posture. "Didn't need to. I figured you'd come." The woman approached, nodding toward the cars. "This the new collection?" Julia shook her head. "Just a reminder." The older woman, revealed now to be a board member from the Women's Design Museum that had honored Julia last year, looked around, noting the silence, the watching eyes. "Did they know who you were?" Julia laughed, but not bitterly. "They didn't need to. That was the point." The manager stepped forward as if drawn by instinct, his voice quiet but earnest. "Ma'am," he said, eyes shifting between Julia and the newcomer. "I just want to say, whatever this was, I think it's changed something for us." Julia didn't respond immediately. She glanced down at the water beating on the Jeep's fender, then up at the slowly setting sun. "That's not for me to say," she answered. "You'll know if it has when I'm not here." She turned to the young technician and walked over, placing a small black card in his hand. "This is the detailer I work with in Marin. He teaches on Saturdays. If you ever want to learn more than just product lines, tell him I sent you." The boy nodded so quickly he almost lost his balance. Claire stepped forward then, hesitant but composed. "Miss Harper," she began, but Julia held up a hand, not to silence her, but to pause her. "You don't owe me an apology," she said gently, "but you might owe one to the next woman who walks in wearing dust instead of diamonds." A long pause followed, deeper than silence, something that reached the spine. Then Julia gave a slight nod, turned toward the waiting Rolls-Royce, and walked away without fanfare. No applause followed, no clapping back, no drama. Just the soft sound of an engine door closing, and the whispered realization that not everything valuable shines at first glance, but it always leaves a mark once you've seen it. The next morning, as the sun rose high over the city, the atmosphere around Clearlux Auto Spa was unmistakably different. The cars were cleaner, shinier, their chrome now gleaming with purpose rather than vanity. Inside, the staff had shifted from their previous self-assuredness into something quieter, more measured. There were no more loud conversations or casual laughter filling the air. Now, everything seemed purposeful, almost reverent. It was as if the very walls of the building had absorbed the shift, adjusting to a rhythm that felt more genuine, more rooted in respect than in routine. The manager, who had once felt the weight of every judgment upon his shoulders, now moved with a different kind of authority. It was no longer the authoritative stance of someone trying to enforce rules, but the confident posture of someone who had learned a quiet lesson. His gaze was softer when it met the eyes of his staff, as if he had finally seen them for who they were. Not just employees, but people. There were no grand gestures or speeches, but there was something in the air that had changed. A subtle but undeniable difference in the way people moved, the way they treated each other, the way they saw the world outside their own narrow lanes. Claire, the receptionist, sat at her desk with a newfound sense of humility. She didn't rush to the phone or to the customer waiting at the door. Instead, she greeted each person with a small, genuine smile, something she hadn't known how to offer the day before. She noticed the little things now, the small details that had always been there, but that she had overlooked: the kindness in a customer's voice, the nervous glance of a new hire, the subtle tension in the air when a job wasn't done well. Everything felt different, lighter, as though she had unclipped herself from a weight that had been holding her in place for years. In the corner of the lot, the old Jeep Wagoneer still sat, its dusty frame no longer a symbol of neglect but of memory, of something passed down and cared for, untouched by the surface-level judgments that once defined this place. It was a simple vehicle, but now it stood proudly among the polished supercars, just as Julia had wanted it. A reminder that the most important things in life aren't always the most polished, the most glamorous, or the most expensive, but the ones that have been lived with, loved, and understood. The crew worked silently now, focused, engaged in a task they had long taken for granted: caring for machines. But now, it wasn't just about the cars, it was about how they cared for them, how they approached the work with respect and consideration. The shift was quiet but significant, and it was one that had not come through any loud declarations or forceful actions, but through a woman's quiet insistence on dignity and respect, for both herself and for the work she did. By midday, Julia's car was gone, as were the fleet of exotic vehicles that had once so dramatically entered. But the echo of their presence lingered, not as an act of rebellion, but as a reminder that true value can never be defined by appearance alone. It lies deeper in the way we treat others, in the choices we make when no one is looking, and in the respect we offer without needing anything in return. And as the final rays of sunlight began to fade behind the clouds, the manager stood at the edge of the lot, watching the workers move with renewed focus, understanding that the real change wasn't in the vehicles or the work itself. It was in the quiet transformation that had taken place within each of them, a transformation that would stay long after the last car had driven away,